You won't believe what triggered one of the ugliest HOA wars in our neighborhood. Not a loud party, not an illegal addition, not even a barking dog. No, it all began with a mailbox. The Sanderson family had lived in Maplewood Estates for just under a year. They were quiet, friendly people with 2 kids in elementary school, the kind of neighbors you'd want next door. Their home was modest but well kept, with fresh flowers blooming out front, a trimmed lawn, and a brand new mailbox they'd installed just last month. The mailbox was sturdy, neat, and painted in a dark shade of black that gleamed just a little when the sunlight hit it. Nobody thought much of it until HOA President Margaret Wilkins decided otherwise. Margaret was the kind of HOA president who thrived on control. In her pastel blazers and pearls, she paraded around the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, treating every lawn, fence, and mailbox like it was her personal kingdom. One morning, the Sandersons received an official letter from the HOA. It wasn't a friendly note, nor was it a simple warning. Instead, the letter slapped them with a $1,000 fine for noncompliance with community aesthetic standards. The supposed violation: their mailbox paint was too glossy. At first, the Sandersons thought it had to be a joke, $1,000 for shine, but Margaret was dead serious. The letter threatened additional penalties if the fine wasn't paid within 30 days, and even hinted at possible lien action against their property. When word spread around Maplewood Estates, most neighbors were shocked. $1,000 for mailbox paint? Some laughed, others rolled their eyes, but everyone agreed it was excessive. Still, nobody wanted to cross Margaret. Over the years, she had fined people for having flower pots that were too colorful, for leaving garbage cans out a few minutes too long, and even for kids leaving bikes on the driveway. She thrived on intimidation, and most people paid up rather than fight her. But the Sandersons weren't like most people. Instead of quietly writing a check, they decided they were going to push back. The Sandersons began attending HOA meetings, something most residents avoided because they were nothing short of dreadful. Margaret dominated every discussion, shutting down any opposition and bulldozing through the agenda. But at the very next meeting, Mr. Sanderson raised his hand. "I'd like to ask about our fine," he said calmly. "We were charged $1,000 over our mailbox paint. Can someone explain how that number was determined?" The room went silent. Margaret's face tightened, and she gave a cold smile. "Fines are based on the HOA's discretion, as outlined in the bylaws. Your mailbox was not in compliance." "But $1,000? Mrs. Sanderson chimed in. "That seems outrageous for paint." Margaret banged her gavel and moved on, brushing them off as if the matter were settled. But the Sandersons noticed something odd. When Margaret referenced the bylaws, she never produced them. She only waved a hand and declared her authority. That night, the Sandersons pulled out their copy of the HOA bylaws, the thick packet of legalese handed to every homeowner at closing. They scoured the rules, looking for any mention of mailbox paint. Sure enough, there was a regulation about uniform colors, but it was vague. Nowhere did it say anything about glossy finishes. Nowhere did it mention a $1,000 fine. This raised a troubling question. How was Margaret deciding these fines? The more the Sandersons dug, the stranger things became. They talked to other neighbors and discovered a pattern. One family had been fined $500 for a fence that looked weathered. Another had been charged $750 for leaving garden tools in their side yard. Everyone paid up reluctantly, but nobody had ever seen a clear breakdown of how fines were calculated or where the money went. Suspicion grew. The HOA collected dues from every household, nearly 200 homes at $300 a year. On top of that, fines like theirs could add up to tens of thousands of dollars. Yet the neighborhood pool was crumbling, the clubhouse had peeling paint, and the landscaping along the entrance sign hadn't been maintained in years. Where was all that money going? The Sandersons started to suspect that the glossy mailbox fine wasn't really about paint at all. It was about control, and maybe something far worse. The turning point came when Mr. Sanderson had an unexpected conversation with the HOA treasurer, a man named Greg. Greg was a quiet accountant who rarely spoke at meetings, often sitting at the far end of the table while Margaret dominated the floor. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion, Mr. Sanderson caught him in the parking lot. "Greg," he asked carefully, "do you know how fines are decided? Because I looked through the bylaws, and I can't find anything that explains it." Greg hesitated. His eyes darted toward the clubhouse door where Margaret had just exited. He lowered his voice. "I can't talk here," he whispered, "but let's just say not everything adds up." Intrigued, the Sandersons invited him over for coffee later that week. That's when Greg revealed what he knew. The HOA's finances were a mess. Margaret controlled the checkbook, and though Greg was listed as treasurer, she rarely allowed him access to the actual bank statements. Whenever he asked, she would hand him typed summaries instead of raw numbers. And every time he tried to question her, she shut him down. But recently, Greg had stumbled across something troubling: a receipt for a personal vacation package charged to the HOA account. Another time, he noticed payments going to a consulting firm that didn't seem to exist. He suspected embezzlement but had no proof because Margaret tightly guarded the records. That was all the Sandersons needed to hear. They knew the only way to stop the madness was to expose her. Together, they formed a small alliance with a few other neighbors who had been unfairly fined. They began requesting official records under state HOA transparency laws. When Margaret stalled or refused, they kept pushing. They documented every suspicious fee, every ridiculous fine, every vague explanation. One night, they even caught a break. During a rushed meeting, Margaret accidentally left behind a binder of financial papers. Greg quickly snapped photos before she returned. The pages told the story in black and white. HOA funds weren't being spent on community maintenance. They were being siphoned into Margaret's personal expenses. Thousands of dollars were missing, hidden behind fake invoices and inflated maintenance charges. The glossy mailbox fine suddenly made sense. Margaret wasn't enforcing rules for the sake of beauty. She was creating a slush fund, and anyone who questioned her got hit with an outrageous fine. Please like and subscribe. Armed with evidence, the Sandersons knew they couldn't confront Margaret directly. She would simply deny everything and try to intimidate them. Instead, they took their findings to the state's HOA regulatory board and hired a lawyer to draft a formal complaint. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. Word had spread that something big was about to go down. Margaret sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, her usual smug expression plastered across her face. But this time, she wasn't in control. Mr. Sanderson stood up and calmly addressed the crowd. "We've all wondered where our HOA money goes. Well, we've done some digging, and the truth isn't pretty." He began laying out copies of the financial records for everyone to see, pages showing personal vacations, luxury purchases, and phantom companies. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Neighbors flipped through the papers, shaking their heads in disbelief. Margaret slammed her gavel, shouting that it was all lies, that the documents were stolen, that this was an attack against her character. But the evidence was undeniable. Greg, the treasurer, finally spoke up, his voice trembling but firm. "I can confirm these records are real. I've been kept in the dark, but this is what I found. Margaret has been misusing HOA funds." The crowd turned on her instantly. Years of frustration boiled over as residents shouted their grievances. People who had been fined unfairly stood up, waving their letters in anger. The board had no choice. A motion was made to remove Margaret as president, and it passed unanimously. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her face red with rage, but she never returned. In the weeks that followed, investigators confirmed the embezzlement. Margaret faced serious legal consequences, and the HOA's finances were restructured with full transparency. For the first time in years, the neighborhood actually saw their dues go toward real improvements: repairs to the pool, fresh landscaping, and a proper reserve fund. As for the Sandersons, their $1,000 mailbox fine was not only rescinded, but the new board reimbursed them for the stress and legal costs. Their glossy black mailbox still stands at the end of their driveway, a small but shining reminder that standing up to injustice is always worth it. And every time sunlight hits that mailbox, the gleam feels a little brighter, because it isn't just paint anymore. It's a symbol of victory. Like and subscribe.